So next up is Emma Morgan. She's a project coordinator in the Family Violence Philanthropy Collaboration Project for DV Victoria, and Tamara White from the Centre for Family Research and Evaluation. And they will present on a place-based approach to improving outcomes for children and young people experiencing or using violence in their interpersonal relationships. So it will cover working collaboratively across service providers in Geelong to improve responses to adolescent family violence. So I'll hand over to you ladies.
Thanks. Hello. Does this thing work? Ooh, it does. Yes. An alternative title to our presentation is Every Opportunity for Change, Improving Outcomes for Children and Young People Experiencing and or Using Violence in Their Interpersonal Relationships. So before I get into it too much though, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Boon Wurrung and Wurrung or Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge those Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. This land was never ceded, and the impacts of colonisation, the violent thefts of land and culture, and destruction of people and language continue to be felt by all Indigenous communities across Australia, and really does have implications for the conversations we're having here today. So I want to hold that in mind as we proceed. So I'm Emma Morgan, as mentioned. I am the project coordinator for the Family Violence Philanthropy Collaboration Project. I'll let Tamara introduce herself shortly, but just for those of you who don't know about DV Vic, we are the peak body for specialist family violence services across the state of Victoria. We're an independent non-government organisation, and we mainly focus on policy development, practice development and advocacy, and work on behalf of our member organisations, utilising an intersectional feminist approach to our family violence work. As the peak body, we hold a central position in the Victorian family violence system and its strategic governance, and we're one of the key agencies with responsibility for providing family violence subject matter expertise, technical assistance, capacity building, and then policy practice advice to all those people listed up there. Over to you, Tamara.
Can you hear me if I stand here, or do we need to cuddle?
I feel like we should sing.
My name's Tamara White. I'm the Consultancy Manager at the Centre for Family Research and Evaluation. We're a collaborative applied research centre located within Drummond Street Services. So we work with other organisations. We both look after Drummond Street's own in-house evaluation, but we also provide consultancy advice to other organisations, particularly those delivering child and family services, where we can share our experience of building the evidence for the programs that we deliver at Drummond Street. Some of you might have caught Karen's presentation before lunch. So we're located within Drummond Street. And we also do research within Queer Space, which is part of Drummond Street as well. A big focus of what we do is capacity building of staff, project teams and organisations to be able to generate and use evidence in their work, particularly with a focus on the use of evaluation data. And we're also experienced in designing and planning programs, as well as training and mentoring. So DV Vic invited us to partner with them in delivering this project, really bringing that kind of process and facilitation expertise to the project.
Yeah. So just to give you a bit of background context, because I suppose this presentation today is a little bit different from maybe some of the other presentations we've heard today, in that really we're describing an approach that we've taken to developing a project that we're yet to deliver, but kind of want to talk you through that process and what we've learned through that, and a bit of the reasoning behind it. So in order to make sense of that, I just want to give you a bit of context. So as I mentioned, I am the project coordinator for the Family Violence Philanthropy Collaboration Project, which in a nutshell, is a philanthropically funded project to support philanthropy's contributions to the implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations. It's been going for about 2 years to date, and where we've kind of landed is an approach to grant making that can harness the sort of unique kind of vantage point or position that DBVIC can offer, so that we can develop a comprehensive picture of the whole landscape, identify strategic areas for grant, where there aren't grant-ready projects, and utilising our expertise and networks and relationships, start to broker partnerships and see if we can develop projects in key strategic areas. And so that we can then take back to our network of philanthropic and corporate funders to consider for funding. So in the course of that work and the sort of consultation and research I did on behalf of the funders, adolescent family violence came through as a really strong area of need, as well as had really strong alignment with many of those funders' kind of priority funding areas. Just to also kind of provide a bit of background as well, I just kind of wanted to paint a little bit of a backdrop around sort of specialist family violence service kind of approaches to adolescent family violence, or kind of where we're at in thinking about this. As we've heard today, and I don't think many people will argue, this really is an emergent area or field of practice for people across many different sectors. I think one of the challenges of adolescent family violence is that it does occur at the intersection of so many different service systems and sectors that each bring their own language and understanding and frameworks to how to address it or work for better outcomes. From DBVIC's perspective, I mean, obviously we think of family violence as being fundamentally driven by gender inequality, and we bring that lens to all of the forms of family violence that we work with. But in a more nuanced way than that, we bring an intersectional feminist understanding of family violence that acknowledges that while gender inequality is a necessary condition for family violence, it's not the only or necessarily the most prominent factor in every context. And so what that means for adolescent family violence, for example, is that we would understand that even when there might be different parties at play, even if it's a young person's violence towards their siblings, even if that family hasn't necessarily had a known history of family violence in the past, we would still see that because it happens in the context of family, which is a deeply gendered performance and practice and institution, it still happens on the backdrop of many of the same conditions that other forms of family violence occur, and that informs the way we think about it. And more recently, we have redeveloped our code of practice for specialist family violence services, and I just thought it might be helpful to kind of highlight what that code of practice says about adolescent family violence and our work with children and young people more broadly when it comes to their experience of family violence, which is that, we worked towards, service provision where infants, children and young people are recognised as victim survivors in their own right, and that their safety and well-being is prioritised at every stage, that the term perpetrator is only applied to adults who use family violence, and when a child or young person is using family violence against their parents or carers or other family members, that the term of perpetrator isn't appropriate, and that we're often using the terminology of adolescent who uses family violence. We see family violence very much as a social issue, not an individual pathology, and therefore we see that responses to family violence need to comprise of both individual therapeutic interventions as well as independent advocacy and systems change, both in the individual work case managers do with victim survivors and in the broader work that our services do in the sector to ensure that every victim survivor coming through the system receives the response that they are entitled to, because we recognise that depending on who you are and how you turn up, you might get a very different response from police or the justice system or the health system. So in thinking about that, it's a long way of getting to this rather confusing diagram. which is about how we make sense of complex problems. So just to quickly explain this pretty annoying diagram, this is a sort of this is a framework called the Carnarvon framework that was developed by someone called Dave Snowden, which is a way of coming to think about complex problems and how people respond to different complex problems. So we have the domain of the obvious, where you know, you do an intervention and you know the outcome, and you can kind of measure it quite quickly. An analogy we use is a recipe. You follow the recipe, you get the cake. Then there's complicated problems, which the cause and effect are a bit more kind of at a distance. You might need some real expertise, you might need some really serious resourcing, but you can get there. So the analogy is maybe building a rocket ship or doing brain surgery. And then you move into the domain of the complex, where the cause and the effect are less directly correlated or less directly seen. And the analogy here is maybe like raising a child, right? You do the best you can based on the evidence available, but fundamentally you're not going to know until maybe they're 30 or 40 whether or not you've done a good job. And to an extent, I have started to conceptualise the problem of improving adolescent family violence outcomes in this domain because it happens at the intersection of these different service systems. And we are part of those service systems, right? And when you move something over here, it affects something over here. And so we're in the mix, we're implicated in this, and it's a lot more difficult to figure out if you're making progress or the best way forward. And it really does require a collaborative approach. I'm mindful of the time. So, I mean, I guess that's just a long way of saying that we decided to take this collaborative approach to developing a project in Geelong because we recognise that finding a way forward and really if we wanted to think about systems change rather than rather than focusing on what's the right therapeutic intervention for individual families, then we needed to be thinking about bringing together different kinds of expertise and specialisation and authority to come together and find some common understanding. And so today we're just sort of talking a bit about that process that we took.
So in terms of designing the process that we were going to undertake in this project, it was a little bit of stepping into the unknown. Geelong was chosen to develop this work because it had an existing dedicated adolescent family violence program, Step Up at BCYF, which meant that we had the opportunity to explore what else would be required to meet the needs of the diverse young people and experiences in that community. And that location was also strengthened due to funder support for a place-based initiative and a history of collaboration in the region. So we started off with a forum for service providers to attend in October, and Elena Campbell, who we heard from this morning, gave us a little insight into what was coming in the PIPA report. And then we planned a series of co-design workshops with interested service providers to come back and talk through some of the ideas that might have been stimulated by the forum and begin to map out what it might look like. We didn't have a predetermined goal, but we knew that if we were going to be talking about a complex problem, that goal was unlikely to be a program that was going to be set up and run and rolled out within the area. They already had a program. So we weren't looking for something that was the way things have kind of been done before. The co-design sessions looked at current evidence and rates, drivers and best practice responses to adolescent family violence. We did some local service system mapping, discussion between agencies about what language they use and find useful. We talked about frameworks and responses that we were aware of in relation to adolescent family violence, and looking at root causes and effects of the current limitations of the system to respond to children, young people and families impacted by family violence. Not so much the experience of an individual, but what is happening at the moment within the system in that particular area. And then as a result of those co-design workshops, we looked at drafting some kind of proposed response, service response, that DVVIC then takes back to philanthropy partners to see whether they will fund it. So the feedback we received was that it was a useful process. It was difficult for everyone to kind of leave their agendas at the door and just talk about this issue in a constructive way. But I think having those stages, having a lot of engagement with partners between the co-design sessions was really useful as well, so that people could reflect and think about what they thought of it and what their interest levels were for the next session. As much as possible, we tried to have the same people at the session so that the conversation progressed rather than having the same conversation again and again. And yeah, you can read some of the feedback that we received, really trying to be collaborative and recognise an approach for multiple agencies to contribute towards. So really what we focused on in terms of a problem, what does adolescent family violence look like in Geelong? And some of the activities we did, as I mentioned, service mapping, talking about terminology, talking about where children and adolescents impacted by violence intersect with this current service system. What we really discovered was we didn't have a lot of evidence on which to make a decision about where we needed to go next. We didn't really understand the problem other than in an anecdotal way. We did realise that a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to suit this problem. That's a theme we've heard already today. And we did recognise that the current system does not work for families and young people. So some initial ideas of what we need in a response you can see there, but it really was doing things differently.
And we deliberately, no, that's all right. I was just going to say, we deliberately cast the net quite wide in terms of we were thinking about adolescent family violence in the home, but also young people using violence in an intimate partner context. We were also thinking about the fact that when we use the term young people or adolescents, we're often talking about a really large kind of age bracket from 10 to 25. And that in fact, when we start to look at the evidence around, you know, historical experiences of family violence, we had to look back even further to, you know, infanthood and prenatal conditions in terms of that. So we were really looking at it as kind of macro as we could.
And that was one of the advantages of this project, is we weren't working within some funding guidelines in terms of constraints. We were able to be relatively open. Our reflections from the systems mapping process was that we need to be able to adapt to the individual needs and contexts of young people, and that we need to find a way that the system responds to the needs and works around the needs of families rather than expecting them to fit into our system requirements. In terms of language, our working definition of talking about the terminology is children and adolescents impacted by and or using violence in their interpersonal relationships. So again, a pretty broad definition, but the group felt that it was important not to narrow it down and miss something out. I won't spend too much time on this, but the principles that we, as a group, wanted to centre in the design of a response was about being inclusive, was about action research, so really building the evidence and using this as an opportunity to learn more rather than just to deliver something, that it needs to be tailored to client needs, it is inherently place-based, and is about building trust, because we know that the system has let most families down along the way and that trust has been eroded. Strength-based, person-centred, in alignment with other strategy, like when we know this isn't happening in a vacuum, there's lots of other things happening in the state. We want it to be able to work alongside that, not in competition. And also as early intervention as possible. Areas of focus, we talked before, intimate partner violence, for children who have experienced family violence, police response, complex care coordination where there are a lot of services involved with a particular family, improving responses where there's comorbidity with disability, other developmental delay, etc., and also improving responses where there's young people in out-of-home care. and also bringing a relational trauma lens to that. So, we didn't give ourselves an easy task by any means, but we wanted to I think, it's a complex problem. It's not going to be solved by a simple solution. We did a little survey with after when we kind of determined drivers, just to get a sense from people of where they thought the focus needed to be, what were the priorities. So I'll just let you have a review of that. These are structural drivers, again, not talking about the individual behaviour, but rather the system. And then some potential activities were also surfaced.
Can you guys read that?
Yeah. Sorry, you need us to zoom in? Sorry. So I think I've covered a lot of those things, but voice of young people, capacity building, action research, dedicated service model that's around the system working together, and coordination of services.
And really, to kick that off, the establishment of some form of consortium of services that can come together, align their work, agree on a common language, start to develop some common assessment tools, not risk assessment tools, but rather, intervention tools, like assessment tools, and start to, come up with a plan for developing a model. Yeah. And then lastly, towards the end, we started to consider some models that we can maybe have been established or that we can see currently that might give us some signposts to the kinds of things that could be useful in this context. And so we considered RAMP, the Risk Assessment Management Panels. So just at high level for those of you who aren't familiar, that's a family violence mechanism focused on high and imminent risk. It's really short-term intervention with an emphasis on accountability for perpetrators, adult perpetrators, short-term intervention and monthly convening, and that's a Victorian-based model. We also considered the Integrated Safety Response, or ISR, which is a New Zealand model. It's, again, a family violence focused model that works with high risk and complex families. There's an emphasis on case management response to perpetrators and, in fact, a multi-worker case management model. So you have a case manager for children, one for the adult victim survivor and one for the adult perpetrator, and then someone at the top coordinating that work. And you also have a dedicated resourced Indigenous leader or elder kind of role in that as well. And then also Partners in Recovery, which was a federally funded model of complex care coordination that worked in the mental health space. So without getting too much detail, just some of the things we sort of kind of surfaced out of those conversations that might be helpful in this context. I won't go through them all, but essentially, the ability to bring diverse people together in an authorising environment where decision making can happen around that table and barriers can be identified and responded to at that table. So rapid wraparound decision making, flexibility and ability to mould the response to the context of the young person and their family, and then having this sort of consortium of services that sit behind it to support that authorising environment and systems change work, as well as the linkage and being able to bring the services to the family and have everyone kind of on the same page. So where we landed was that a definition of the problem and a project goal. So we landed on a definition that says that the problem is a systematic failure to identify and respond to the needs of children and young people and families impacted by and or using violence in their interpersonal relationships. And that a project goal, end goal, blue sky thinking, would be a service system that responds to every opportunity for change for every child, young person and family in Geelong. You want to talk to that? Yeah.
So we identified that in order to try to achieve this goal, we needed to establish and facilitate a consortium of services and have an agreed way of working together, agreed language and measurements. We needed to analyse what's happening within the local system provide a mechanism for the voice of children and young people into the project, and build the resources and training for service providers and practitioners in the region. Being able to develop a kind of wraparound service response that's going to attempt to meet this need in the area, and also complete some action research that's going to contribute to the evidence base for best practice tertiary responses. So what we are looking to achieve in the medium term is that not a new program, but a service system response, and looking at how the service system can change rather than individual practitioners needing to change, which means an alignment of practice, an identification of system barriers, and looking at ways of addressing those system barriers by the consortium. We are looking for children and young people and families to be able to report that they're receiving the support that they need, and that we have evidence-based responses to children and young people experiencing or using violence in their relationships to lead to better outcomes. So I guess this is the kind of like, let's see, wait and see, come back, and you'll be able to, I guess, hear where we go with this, but we're not rushing into just rolling something out until we know that we've actually got the problem identified and we know what we're working towards and have done it in a thorough collaborative way.
Yeah. So, I mean, really this is a unique situation where we have funders willing to kind of resource this kind of process, and so we're able to sort of take the kind of microcosm of Geelong and think about, you know, in an ideal situation, what would be needed and what kind of process is needed to make systems change and what we can learn from that process. So we're currently in the process of finalising that proposal and finalising who's going to play what role in that project proposal, and confirming the funding, and setting up the project governance and collective impact infrastructure. So, I mean, this is essentially a collective impact project that will take. It's a multi-year project, and yeah.
Watch this space.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You talked about the consortium partners,
Mm-hmm.
is it? I'm wondering if you engaged with neighbourhood houses or community centres in Geelong.
Not yet. So who we have engaged with is Staff Centre, BCYF, Bethany Community Support, Gateways Disability Support, McKillop Family Services, Drummond Street, VicPol, Department of Education, the Respectful Relationships team, Bat Force, the Barwon Family Violence Regional Integration Committee, Watherong, Big Brother, Big Sister, and the Barwon Community Legal Centre. So that's the kind of starting point, and then from there there'll be consideration of who else needs to come on, including places like Diversitat, perhaps the PHN, perhaps local council, and like you say.
And there's likely to be the steering group as well. The consortium is likely to be really service system providers, but of course we're consulting with those who are also affected will be an important component.
I ask because there's always, I think, a bit of a dilemma around there's a service system, but then there's a community setting that is embedded in the community, and it has a different reach, and it's a really creative reach and very flexible and innovative.
Thank
So
you.
it's just worth.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I really think this is a great way, and I think it's great that you're taking the time to make sure that the service response is going to be a great one. But coming from quite a regional area, I still we see a lot of metrocentric type stuff, and I know that Geelong's been referred to as a regional city, but for those of us that live in townships or areas that only have, say, 5,000 people, how does the service response that you can deliver, say, for Geelong, when you're looking at that, and then potentially rolling that out as a wider ranging thing, how do you look at the flexibility to adapt that to a more regional setting?
That's a really good point. I mean, like I said, part of the reason why Geelong was chosen was because we have a place-based funder who wants to fund this process, and also it's one of 3 places that has an existing dedicated adolescent family violence program. And I think as well, part of what we're hoping to capture through this process is the process. I think really when it comes, people talk about the need for there to be a multi-agency coordinated response. How you actually do that is really difficult, and you can't kind of come up with a model and transport it to one place or another. You can document a process for how you do it, and I suppose for me that would be the answer, that we would go through this thorough process to sort of, I guess, propose an approach, a place-based approach. But yeah, certainly take your point that there are perpetual need for funding in the regions that are actually regions. Yeah.
We currently have an orange door being built. The door isn't on yet. How does this fit with orange door?
Yeah, look, I mean, in Bowen there is an orange door. And so their involvement, I mean, the partners who've been around the table are also part of the consortium of the orange door. I suppose for us, orange door is an important sort of lever for referral pathways. But, I mean, I think the danger with the orange door is people waiting for it as if it's going to be the solution we're waiting for. It is a door, yeah. If there's nothing behind the door for young people, it's not really going to make much of a difference. Yeah.
Do you have like a target timeline for this, like with implementation?
We're hoping to have something funded by midway through the year, so we can start at least in that initial sort of establishment phase, from July onward. Again, with that real emphasis on kind of doing this mini process that we've done properly. Do you know what I mean? Like doing that deep kind of analysis of the system and really finding a way to bring in the voices of lived experience as well in a meaningful way.
And over 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, so we would imagine that there's a developmental kind of year, and then from there we would be at a point to sort of say this is a model we've developed together and we all agree on, and we're going to test it in this way and get some funding to do it.
All right, great. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Very much.